The train moaned like an animal as it rolled through the Belgian night. Wooden wheels shrieked against steel, echoing through the dark fields between Mechelen and the border. Inside, more than 1,600 men, women, and children were packed into sealed cattle cars, so tight that many could not sit down. The air was thick with sweat and fear. Somewhere ahead, a soldier's boot thudded on the roof. Somewhere behind, a baby cried and would not stop. No one expected the train to ever stop. It was the 20th convoy to leave Belgium for Auschwitz, and every convoy before it had gone straight to death. The prisoners knew this. Some had hidden notes in their shoes. Others whispered prayers that dissolved into the clatter of the tracks. They had been told the journey would last 2 days. Most knew they would not see the second dawn. But that night, April 19th, 1943, something impossible waited along the tracks ahead. A red lantern flickered in the dark near the village of Boortmeerbeek. 3 young men crouched beside the railbed, faces hidden by scarves, the metal smell of the signal lamp mixing with damp earth. They were barely older than boys. Youra Lipschitz, Robert Maistriau, and Jean Franklemon. They had one pistol, a pair of pliers, and a plan that could only fail once. The locomotive's headlight bloomed through the mist, growing brighter, louder, until the earth trembled. At the last second, the red lantern rose. The train slowed. The German engineer, thinking there was danger on the line, braked hard. For the first time in Nazi-occupied Europe, a deportation convoy began to stop. Hit subscribe and like the video. You won't want to miss what comes next. By the end of this story, you'll understand how 3 students and hundreds of desperate passengers turned one night of terror into the only mass escape from a Holocaust train in history. Steam hissed from the halted locomotive. The guards shouted down the line, confused. In the fog, Lipschitz fired a single shot into the air, a signal. Maistriau ran to the nearest wagon, his hands shaking as he cut through the padlock with pliers. The door burst open, and bodies tumbled into the cold night air. A woman screamed. Someone whispered, "Jump!" Behind the first car, others heard the commotion and began to move. Fists hammered against planks, metal bars groaned, nails tore free. The guards scrambled, firing into the dark, but it was too late. The rhythm of the train had been broken. For the first time, the deported were no longer only passengers. They were fugitives. The lantern lay burning on the gravel as the train lurched forward again, leaving behind a trail of footprints, blood, and silence. The 3 saboteurs vanished into the woods. Behind them, in the sealed wagons, prisoners began to whisper through the slats. Some prayed, some planned, and some simply pressed their palms against the boards, feeling the vibration of a train that, for one night, could still be stopped. When the German army marched into Belgium in 1940, the occupation came with lists, decrees, and a precision that left no space for doubt. The anti-Jewish laws arrived first. Curfews, armbands, banned professions, confiscated radios, the quiet stripping away of ordinary life. Then came the roundups. Entire families were ordered to report to a converted barracks in the city of Mechelen. Kaserndosen, a name that would become synonymous with disappearance. By 1942, Mechelen had become the nerve center of the machinery of deportation. The Gestapo's system worked with mechanical efficiency. Jews from across Belgium were registered, photographed, numbered, and packed into convoys bound for Auschwitz. Each train carried roughly 1,000 people. There were 20 such convoys in total. 19 left unchallenged. The trains departed at night, cattle cars locked from the outside, a bucket for water, another for waste. No food, no light, no hope. Inside were doctors, shopkeepers, children clutching dolls. Whole communities vanished between dusk and dawn. Rumors spread of where the trains went, but no one dared to believe the full truth. Some said it was resettlement. Others whispered of gas and fire. Everyone knew that no one came back. Resistance in Belgium grew quietly. Leaflets, coded messages, hidden radios. But to attack a deportation train was unthinkable. The Nazi apparatus was too well guarded, the reprisals too severe. Even the bravest cells hesitated. Yet among the underground networks that formed in Brussels, one small group began to plan the impossible. They called themselves part of the Comité de défense des Juifs, the Jewish Defense Committee. Though their membership was broader, students and doctors and teachers bound by outrage more than ideology. Among them were 3 young men who refused to accept that every train had to reach Auschwitz. They studied the schedules, the track maps, and the gaps between patrols. They borrowed a revolver, found a pair of pliers, and built a red lantern from a wine bottle and a pocket torch. It would be their only weapon against a machine built to erase thousands. Meanwhile, inside Kaserne Dawson, families were being loaded into Convoy 20. The date was April 19th, 1943. It was the eve of Passover, the same night that Jewish fighters in Warsaw would rise against the ghetto walls. In Belgium, no one knew about that yet, but the air carried the same tension, the same impossible defiance. At sunset, 1,631 people were herded onto the train. The youngest was barely a year old, the oldest 79. The guards sealed each door and stamped the manifest. The locomotive hissed and pulled away, heading east toward the border and the camps beyond. It was just another convoy in a long, unbroken line of death. No one, not the guards, not the prisoners, imagined that this one would be different. But in a small apartment in Brussels, 3 students were already on their bicycles, pedaling into the night with a pistol, a lantern, and a plan no one thought could work. The rails ahead would soon glow red with their defiance. They were students, not soldiers. Their courage came from outrage, not training. Youra Lipschitz, a 22-year-old Polish-Jewish medical student, had lost most of his extended family to the deportations already. Robert Maistriau, 21, studied engineering, known among his friends for his calm under pressure. Jean Franklemon, 25, was a medical intern and resistance courier. All 3 were members of Belgium's underground networks, the Comité de défense des Juifs and the Front de l'Indépendance. But they were on their own that night. There was no order from above, no grand coordination. Just 3 young men and an idea that bordered on madness: stop a deportation train in motion, open the doors, and free whoever dared to run. In the weeks before April 19th, they studied the Mechelen-Leuven railway line. They walked the tracks at dusk, counting seconds between guard patrols. They marked a gentle curve near Boortmeerbeek, where trains slowed before the next signal. That would be their ambush point. Lipschitz acquired a single revolver from another resistance cell. Maistriau found an old pair of pliers to cut locks. Franklemon built a makeshift red lantern using a bicycle lamp wrapped in cellophane, convincing enough to pass for a railway signal. They had no uniforms, no backup, no illusions. The plan was suicidal, and they knew it. Yet they also knew that Convoy 20 carried more than 1,600 people, mothers, fathers, children, and that if they did nothing, every one of them would vanish into smoke. That evening, as the light faded from the sky, the 3 men loaded their bicycles with the few tools they had and rode out of Brussels. The streets were quiet under curfew, every window darkened. German patrols passed without noticing them. Just 3 cyclists heading toward the countryside. They hid the bicycles near the trees and crawled to the edge of the tracks. Lipschitz checked his watch. The train was scheduled to depart Mechelen around 8:30 p.m. It would take roughly 90 minutes to reach this stretch of track. They waited in silence, the night filled with the distant rhythm of rails. When the glow of the locomotive appeared in the distance, their hands trembled. Franklemon raised the red lantern, letting its light sway gently from side to side, the universal signal for danger ahead. The German engineer, seeing the warning, eased the throttle and began to brake. Sparks sprayed from the wheels as the massive train screeched to a halt. The 3 students leapt into action. Lipschitz fired a shot into the air, his heart pounding. Maistriau ran to the nearest wagon and cut the heavy chain that sealed the door. It swung open, and the air inside burst outward with the smell of fear, sweat, and disbelief. Faces stared out through the darkness. Someone whispered, "Are you partisans?" Maistriau shouted, "Run!" and began pulling people down from the wagon. 17 prisoners jumped in that first minute, stumbling into the brush, vanishing between trees. The guards further down the line shouted, confused, firing blindly into the night. One bullet struck sparks off the tracks. Another hit a tree inches from Lipschitz's head. They had no time to open another car. Lipschitz fired again, buying seconds. Franklemon grabbed the lantern and waved it down the line, trying to make the engineer think there was more danger ahead. Then, realizing the Germans would regroup at any moment, the 3 men fled into the woods. The train began to move again, wheels grinding, gathering speed toward the border. But now, chaos was spreading through its length. Inside the locked wagons, prisoners had seen what happened. They began to shout to one another through the boards, banging, prying, desperate. Some used belts and nails to force the bars on the tiny windows. Some tore at the wood until their hands bled. A few managed to leap as the train picked up speed. Many didn't survive the fall. But the idea had been lit like a fuse. 3 young men had stopped a machine that was never meant to stop. And for the first time, hundreds inside knew there was a chance, however small, to live. The convoy rolled into the countryside, gathering speed again, but the silence inside the wagons had shattered. The moment the train had stopped at Bortmeerbeek, a rumor began to spread from car to car that someone outside had opened a door, that escape was possible, that the guards were confused. Hope, long dormant, turned into motion. Inside one wagon, a group of men began pounding the walls with their shoulders. Nails snapped, splinters flew. In another, belts were looped through window bars, twisting, pulling, cracking the iron from its hinges. Every sound of resistance echoed like thunder in the confined air. People screamed, prayed, argued. Mothers clutched their children, torn between staying together or sending them toward a moving darkness that might be freedom or death. Some hesitated, frozen by terror. Others decided in a single heartbeat. They jumped. As the train rattled on through open fields, silhouettes leapt from the cars, first a few, then dozens, then hundreds. They hit the ground hard, rolled, crawled into ditches. The Germans inside the guard wagons fired blindly into the night. Muzzle flashes lit the fields like lightning. Every few seconds came the thud of another body hitting the earth. Each sound, one survivor said later, was both horror and hope. Near the rear of the train, a man pried loose a plank with his bare hands. The opening was just wide enough for a child. He lifted his daughter toward it, whispering her name once before pushing her through. She landed in the grass and ran. The man was shot seconds later. The countryside between Mechelen and Leuven filled with fleeing figures. Some tore through hedgerows, others crawled into barns, collapsing from exhaustion. Villagers awoke to the noise and, seeing what was happening, began to open their doors. Farmers hid escapees in haylofts. Nuns from a nearby convent took in the wounded. Others brought water and bread, whispering blessings to people they would never see again. Back on the train, the guards tried to restore order. They slammed the remaining doors shut, hammered new bolts across the broken ones, and shouted down the line. But panic had already spread. Prisoners who couldn't jump began singing. Hymns, prayers, fragments of memory. Anything to drown out the sound of gunfire and screams. For the rest of the journey, the train moved through the night like a ghost, carrying 1,000 people, and the absence of those who had vanished into the fields. When it finally reached the border, the Germans counted the missing. Over 200 had jumped. Roughly half were captured within days, hunted down by patrols and collaborators. But at least 118 made it to freedom, hidden by strangers, smuggled into safe houses, or guided into the underground networks that would carry them through the rest of the war. One eyewitness, years later, said the countryside never sounded the same after that night. You could hear the train, even long after it had passed, he said. It was the sound of people deciding to live. For the first and only time in Nazi-occupied Europe, a deportation convoy had been stopped, from without and from within. And though the train continued east toward Auschwitz, its rhythm was broken. Its silence was gone. For one night, against every law of war and fear, the prisoners had seized back the power to choose. The Germans were furious. Within hours of the escape, patrols swept through the villages along the line, combing fields, barns, and forests with dogs and rifles. Local police were ordered to search every house. The Gestapo interrogated railway workers, accusing them of sabotage. The name Boortmeerbeek was entered into the occupation reports that night, marked as a site of treason. Youra Lipschitz was captured first. Hunted for weeks, he was betrayed by an informer and taken to the Gestapo headquarters in Brussels. They beat him until he could barely stand, demanding the names of collaborators. He said nothing. He was sent to Braindonk, then to Buchenwald, and finally to Dora Mittelbau, where he died in 1944. Jean Franklemon managed to vanish into the underground, smuggling medical supplies to partisans in the Ardennes. Robert Maistriau escaped capture entirely, joining a resistance network that specialized in rescuing Jewish children from deportation. For him, the night at Boortmeerbeek became a vow, to keep fighting in whatever way he could until the war ended. The German response was swift and merciless. The next convoys left under doubled guard, the wagons sealed with barbed wire over the ventilation grills. The prisoners of Convoy 21 were chained inside. The tracks were patrolled. The lesson was clear: never again. Yet the memory of that single train that stopped refused to die. For weeks after the escape, stories drifted through Belgium. Farmers whispered about fugitives hiding in haystacks. Priests told of strangers knocking on rectory doors. In some villages, people quietly passed food and clothing to those who had jumped. Others were arrested for helping, but many more remained silent, choosing risk over betrayal. The Gestapo's official report listed 230 escapees. Roughly 118 survived to liberation. The rest were killed or recaptured, some dying within sight of safety. Yet for those who lived, the act itself became a mark of defiance. The prisoners had not been rescued from outside. they had rescued themselves. Belgian propaganda later broadcast the story through the resistance press. The BBC picked it up months later, describing it as proof that even in the darkest corners of occupied Europe, humanity still fought back. In Berlin, the Gestapo tried to bury the incident. Trains to Auschwitz continued to leave Mechelen until the summer of 1944, but never again without fear. Years later, Maistriau would describe that night with quiet clarity. "We had almost nothing," he said, "a pistol, a lantern, and the certainty that it was better to die standing than live waiting." For the men who planned it, and for the hundreds who leapt into the night, that certainty was enough. The convoy had not reached Auschwitz unbroken. The machinery of extermination had stalled, if only for a moment, but long enough to prove it could. Among those who escaped were stories that would live far beyond Belgium's borders. Simon Gronowski was only 11 years old when he was pushed from the train by his mother. He remembered the door opening, the rush of cold air, and her final words, "Jump, Simon!" He hit the embankment, rolling through nettles until the train's roar faded into silence. A Belgian family found him the next morning and hid him until the liberation. His mother, Chana, never returned. Decades later, he would speak of her courage with a calm that broke every audience's heart. Others escaped into obscurity, their names surviving only in fragments of testimony. Regina and Chaim Posner leapt together, vanishing into the night, found days later by farmers who fed them and guided them south to the resistance. Dr. Charles Wolff, a physician from Antwerp, jumped with his medical bag still tied to his wrist. He broke a leg on landing, but crawled into a ditch and waited until dawn. German patrols passed within meters of him. He would later describe that night as a second birth. Each story carried the same rhythm: fear, fall, survival. Out of the 1,631 aboard, about 230 tried to jump. 118 would live to see freedom again. Some were hidden in barns by villagers who risked execution. Others found their way into organized underground networks, joining the same resistance that had stopped the train. The difference between death and survival often came down to minutes, or the kindness of a stranger who refused to look away. After the war, researchers traced the route of Convoy 20 through testimonies and local archives. The documents revealed a chain of small, silent rebellions. Farmers who left food at the edge of fields. Nuns who dressed fugitives in orphanage uniforms. Station masters who delayed following trains long enough to give the escapees a head start. No single act stopped the Holocaust, but together they fractured its machinery, if only for a night. For the survivors, memory became its own kind of resistance. Some never spoke of what they had done, haunted by those they left behind. Others, like Simon Gronowski, told their stories publicly, insisting that the world remember not only the horror, but the moment when horror was interrupted. "My mother didn't die as a victim," he once said. "She died saving her son." That is what I carry. Every name reclaimed from that night, every testimony, every photograph, became a quiet defiance against the precision of the Nazi record books that had numbered people instead of naming them. Convoy 20's escape was not a miracle. It was a decision made in seconds, multiplied by hundreds, under a sky without mercy. And it proved something larger than itself, that even inside a sealed train built to erase human will, defiance was still possible. In Mechelen, the transport lists show blank spaces where those names should have been crossed off, lines left open because the recorders didn't know what to write. They simply wrote unknown. But history would fill those blanks with the truth. They were the ones who jumped. The aftermath rippled quietly through occupied Belgium. The Germans censored the news, classifying the escape as a minor incident. But word still spread, through whispers, through coded notes, through the underground press. The resistance printed leaflets calling it proof that even a train bound for Auschwitz could be stopped by human hands. For those living under occupation, that message was oxygen. In cafes and safe houses, people spoke the names of the 3 saboteurs in low voices. They were not heroes in any romantic sense. They were proof of conscience. Every occupied country had its silent majorities and its few who chose to act. Belgium now had its story of defiance. The Germans, humiliated, responded with cold efficiency. Convoy 21 departed under armed escort, every vent covered in barbed wire, every wagon inspected twice. The guards were ordered to shoot to kill at any sign of movement. But the damage was done. The image of a stopped train haunted them. The Reich's machinery of deportation had been built on the illusion of inevitability. Bortmeerbeek shattered that illusion. After liberation, when the truth of Auschwitz finally reached Europe in full, the story of the 20th Convoy resurfaced in courtrooms and memorials. Belgian collaborators who had assisted in the deportations faced trial. Some received long prison terms, others death sentences. Their victims' names were read aloud from the deportation lists. 25,000 Jews from Belgium, more than half the country's Jewish population. Only a fraction survived. Yet in every hearing, one fact stood apart. One convoy had not completed its journey. For the survivors, Convoy 20 became both a burden and a banner. It symbolized what defiance could look like and what it cost. Many of the escapees lived the rest of their lives with survivor's guilt, knowing that family members on the same train had stayed behind, trusting that the journey might lead somewhere bearable. The truth of Auschwitz crushed that hope forever. Yet the night of the escape remained a kind of redemption, proof that resistance, even when hopeless, could still matter. Decades later, historians would find Allied radio transcripts mentioning the event. In late 1943, the BBC aired a brief report. In occupied Belgium, a train bound for Poland was halted and prisoners escaped. The enemy's grip is not unbreakable. For listeners across Europe, that sentence was a spark in the dark, anonymous, uncredited, but true. In a war defined by machinery, bureaucracy, and the crushing weight of obedience, Convoy 20 was something rare, a fracture, a reminder that courage could emerge not from armies, but from individuals, a handful of students, a few prisoners, and a single red light on a track that was never meant to turn green again. Half a century later, the red lantern returned. In 1993, a memorial train retraced the route of Convoy 20 from Mechelen to Bortmeerbeek. Survivors stood along the tracks, many of them gray-haired, some leaning on canes, their eyes fixed on the same line of steel that had once carried them toward death. The crowd was silent as the train rolled to a stop at the side of the ambush. A single lantern, identical to the one the 3 students had used, hung glowing in the dusk. It swung faintly in the wind. Among those present was Robert Maistriau, the last surviving saboteur. He was in his 70s now, frail but unshaken. When asked what he remembered most, he said it wasn't the fear or the gunfire. It was the sound of the doors opening and the rush of air that followed. It was the first breath of freedom, he said. You could feel it. That same year, he was honored by Yad Vashem as one of the righteous among the nations. His name joined those of others who had risked everything not to win a war, but to save strangers. Belgium, too, began to reckon with the past. The Kaserne d'Ossyn, once a place of deportation, became a museum and memorial. Its walls display the names of the 25,484 Jews and Roma sent east, among them a list marked Convoy 20, with 1,631 entries, and beside some, the word ontsnapt, escaped. In a system designed to erase individuality, those few words stand like sparks in darkness. The story of the 20th Convoy found its way into classrooms, documentaries, and archives. Each retelling followed the same arc: the sealed train, the red light, the impossible choice. Yet what endures is not the drama of the sabotage, but the quiet rebellion of those inside: men, women, and children who decided that if they must die, they would do so fighting for one more breath. The Holocaust consumed millions, its scale overwhelming any notion of defiance. But the escape of Convoy 20 stands as a single, human-sized interruption, a moment when courage outpaced calculation, when the machinery of death paused because 3 people refused to accept its inevitability. Today, the tracks between Mechelen and Boortmeerbeek still exist. Freight trains pass them every day, their wheels echoing across the same embankments. On certain nights, locals say, when the wind shifts and the air is still, you can almost hear another sound beneath it: the rhythm of footsteps, the pounding of fists on wood, the whisper of the word jump. They couldn't stop the Holocaust, but for one night they stopped the train.